Luton is a part of the Chilterns. It's known as a gap town, so it grew up in one of the valleys, and some of those are fed with streams and rivers and others are dry valleys. And the chalk was all laid down in the Cretaceous period. That was around 65 million years ago. It's a very permeable rock, and it was a very, very thick layer that was laid down at the bottom of the sea. Later, during the period of mountain building that led to the formation of the Alps, the outer ripples of that affected northern France and southern England. It's a bit like a blanket being kind of rucked up so that you've got folds and so on in it. And the area to the north of the Chilterns, the chalk was all eroded away, so that exposes older rocks. To the south of the Chilterns, the chalk is still there, but under London, it's buried under a very, very thick layer of clay. What you're left with is the Chilterns Ridge running roughly from the northeast to the southwest. And within that, there are various valleys that have been carved mainly by glacial action in the various ice ages that we've had. The River Lee lies in one of those glacial valleys. So that's why the valley that Luton's grown up in is quite a sizable valley, but the modern stream is actually quite small, because one time it was fed by melting glacial water, and that obviously created a much bigger valley than it is now. The chalk streams, they are generally derived from clear, clean rocks without much sediment in them, tend to be very sort of fresh, limey water and have a flora and fauna of their own. So they're important internationally because chalk is a very rare rock in global terms. The chalk is a very permeable sponge-like rock. It's full of little tiny cavities. The rain that falls on the Chilterns soaks into the ground. It permeates down to a level until it reaches something that it can't pass through. So that means that you have a water table, and that fluctuates a lot with the weather conditions and the climate at the time. And it also fluctuates according to how much of it we take out of the ground. We do have streams that are temporary in nature. So in some cases, the stream is there nearly all the time, but very occasionally dries up. In other of the valleys, you have the opposite effect. So they're mainly dry, but every now and again, the water table rises and you get a flood. Obviously, we're very used to the River Lee being present most of the time, and it seems to be quite distressing when it sort of appears to disappear under the ground. But a lot of the species are adapted to sort of weathering that. We do need to keep an eye on these things because with global warming we might expect them to dry up more often than they do, and we need to reduce the amount that we extract from the ground in order perhaps to compensate for that. Up until about 10,000 years ago, the whole of the Luton area was essentially covered in ice, because that was the last of the ice ages. There had been people in the Luton area long before that, and a lot of the archaeology exposed the ancient peoples of a couple of 100,000 years ago in the areas where they excavated the clays to make bricks. Prehistoric peoples that moved in and created sort of settlements that have more or less sort of lasted up until the present day came about as a result of the populations moving into the area after the ice had all melted. Later Neolithic period, which is much more settled, people started farming and so on, and we then have pretty much continuous settlement through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and then through into the Roman period up to the modern day. For that last sort of few thousand years, it's been evidence of a population using that area for most of that time. And the main reason would have been the water source. Not only literally as a source of drinking water, but it would have been used latterly for cooking purposes. Because of the spiritual nature, I think, of some of the people that lived in the area, it would have been regarded as a ceremonial site as well. It's sort of a magical thing that the water just sort of happens to flow out of the ground, and I think that's an important consideration, and is perhaps why we have Wallard's Bank surrounding it. There may have been a defensive function, but it might also have been a ceremonial site. And the fact that you had this area where there was a freshwater spring that provided all the needs of people in that early period was very important to them. Also, the river was more navigable than the land would have been, even in Roman times, that boats and things were coming up and down the River Lee, which seems a bit unlikely now. So there was a transport hub as well developing around the river system. Obviously the irrigation possibilities of the water supplies once people settled and they needed to grow their crops. And also water power became increasingly important. Even in the Domesday Book there were 7 water mills recorded in the Luton area. And of course the water was used in the brewing industry, so it really helped the industrialisation of Luton. And if you're looking at connections with the hat industry, you're also looking at the water being necessary for the bleaching and the dyeing and the other processes that went on that enabled the hat industry to flourish locally. At different times it's always been very important, and the emphasis has sort of shifted. And today, of course, it's a recreational facility as well. You know, the ecosystem itself helps us, you know, in an urban environment to connect with nature and so on. We have walkways, we have parks. So I think there's been a kaleidoscopic sort of change in the way in which the river is sort of perceived and how it has fed the development of Luton, but very significant in the town's overall history. Urbanisation produced a number of effects that having the river running through the town became a little bit inconvenient. It became a natural drain. People would have used it as a midden for disposal of, obviously, sewage. I imagine land values were probably increasing in the town centre as well, so if you could cover something over and then build a building over it, then that was kind of beneficial to the development of properties. What tended to happen was it started off with the individual bridges, and then the bits between the bridges gradually kind of filled in. So you'd have a small narrow bridge over a section of the river, and then the road would become wider as traffic became wheeled traffic, say, rather than horse-drawn traffic. So you kind of widened it, and so you had almost a section of culvert, and then you had Bridge Street and Mill Street and so on right the way through the town, and then the gaps in between were then just roofed over and were lost and became almost part of the drainage system. So that was what happened in the town centre. Once you get to the north of the town centre, of course the river is predominantly open right the way up to the source, and there are very few other areas where there are culverted sections. There's a small bit in Wardown Park, for example, but most of it is open. That reflects the fact that it was essentially an agricultural landscape until well into the 20th century. Urban development was really post-war in most of those areas. There was really nothing north of Wardown until the 1950s, for example. So those villages still had an open stream and were essentially, grazing meadows and so on. It's very different to the story of the Lee, I think, in those villages than it is in the town centre. A lot of the development came southwards from Leagrave. So if you look at what is now Austin Road, and then it becomes Trinity Road, and then it goes on to Limbury Road and so on down to Marsh Road where it joins up. That's like a trip through time. And what is really surprising about that is that all the older properties are at the far end of it, because the railway station at Leagrave, which was in a very unpopulated part of the town when it first opened, was a secondary growth point for the urbanisation. The River Lee is very important because it's a habitat corridor through the town. It includes a raft of different types of habitat. There are wetland areas, there are wet woodlands, there are water meadows, hedgerows and other features of the pre-urban landscape. Leagrave Park is possibly the most important site overall because it has such a range of habitats. It does have old alder woodland, was supplemented by a lot of Victorian planting, drier grasslands that are well drained, and then in the lower grounds you have the areas which are marshlands or previously drained areas of marshland. Wetlands were essentially used for grazing purposes, and Leagrave Marsh was a common ground for people of the village to put their livestock, whereas places like Wallard's Bank, even though it's a very important archaeological site, was ploughed as an arable feature. And as you come further south, you'll go through sections of modern-day parkland and allotments. And then you have areas like Fallowfield. Fallowfield, I think, is a very special place because it has that sense of traditional landscape. If you want a real sense of what an old water meadow along the River Lee would have been like, Fallowfield is the place to go. Lakes are sort of a bit of a mixed blessing in a way. One of the problems with lakes is that because the water that enters them from the river, it immediately slows down, and that's why it tends to drop the silt and so on. Lakes like the Luton lakes and Wardown have to be dug out every now and again because they become sort of giant silt traps. If they are maintained, which is quite an expensive business, then they're providing open water habitat for fish and other kind of aquatic species that you wouldn't expect to find on a small river like the Lee itself. But they're not a part of the natural system, they are man-made. Bedfordshire is a fairly small county, and also a county with very distinctive rock types. You've got the clay capping on the chalk, then you've got the chalk, and then you've got the gault clay, and then you've got the green sand, and then you've got the Bedford clays for the brick-making areas, and then right in the very far northwest you have the limestones of the villages around sort of Harrold and that area. So all of those areas had a very distinctive flora in a small part of England. So that made it quite a popular county for small-scale kind of ecologists and people to start working on the plant life. And of course, the best known of those, who was active for most of the 20th century, was John Doney. He wrote the definitive flora of the county in the early 1950s, and his final piece of work was The Wildflowers of Luton. The three most important invasive species that we could get are the Himalayan balsam, which is very, very common in Luton and is a big problem. Giant hogweed, which is a species that came originally from Russia. And the third important species that has become a real pest in recent years is the Canadian goldenrod, which forms very, very dense clumps. But, the list is practically endless. We've got snowberry, we've got box honeysuckle, we've got Lacesteria. Possibly one of the worst nuisance species is bramble. It does tend to exclude other species once it gets a hold. So managing bramble, I think, is probably going to be one of the key issues in the future to try to keep the riverbanks more open than they are. So if we're talking about biodiversity, it's the rarest species which are generally the ones that are most vulnerable and that we're most likely to lose. The key species, I think, in Luton are the white helleborine, the pyramidal orchid, the great pignut, iconic species as well, things like the cowslip, which is, well known, it's not that rare, but it's always a great thing to see because it's an indicator that this is a good piece of grassland. Wildlife in general makes use of the river corridor. We have nesting families of kingfishers along the river. We also have herons and we have grey wagtails. We are increasingly seeing the white egrets moving into the area as they colonise Britain. They are regularly seen now, and we might expect that sooner or later they'll start breeding in the Luton area. The population of the water vole is struggling to survive, I think, partly because of predation by domestic cats. We have a broad corridor that is widely used by bats. I think the most important thing now is that we understand what the resource is, but we haven't got the financial resources yet to provide the kind of levels of management that we want to see. We know what bits of land have the potential. We've got most of them designated and protected through the planning system. We've managed to achieve national designations for sites that were almost derelict, 40 years ago. But what worries me now is that we need to do justice to those designations. We do a lot of community-based work, but now we have a large number of sites. The idea that we can manage them simply with volunteers it's impossible. We need more resource. There are some sites that are in private ownership that I would like to bring into public ownership so that we can actually enact a conservation regime. And we need more people, we need more engagement, and we need more resources to do it. And then making them accessible, so that's physical accessibility, so that people can get to use the areas. It doesn't mean festooning them with all sorts of suburban clutter. It just means good solid paths, proper gateways, enticing entrances, that sort of thing. And intellectual access, so proper interpretation at all levels. So you want to make it accessible, but without destroying the spiritual character that it has that make it special in the first place. And I think that's a knack. And I don't think everybody has that knack to be able to do that. The role of cleaning up the water, not only in the River Lee, but nationally, has become a really big, important issue at the moment. The quality of the actual aquatic habitats will only improve once we solve those big issues about sewage going into the rivers and runoff from the roads with oil and heavy metals and other noxious things going in. We have to get that sorted out. It's not a big river, but it's a very beautiful river. It just needs to be looked after and promoted to people, and then people need to fall back in love with it, and I think that they will.